is a little bit different than the last couple of videos have been. So it's going to be about the two, arguably the two most powerful countries of the 20th century, or in the entire history of the world, you could argue, which are the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which the successor state is now called the Russian Federation. So starting with the history of the United States. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the American colonies were a collection of diverse and growing settlements along the eastern coast of North America. Established primarily by English settlers seeking economic opportunity, religious freedom, and a new start, these colonies developed distinct economies, cultures, and forms of government. Despite being under British rule, the colonies enjoyed a degree of autonomy and self-government, with each colony having its own legislative assembly and local laws. However, tensions between the colonies and the British government began to simmer over issues such as taxation without representation, which eventually became a slogan. We'll go more on that later. Trade restrictions and the presence of British troops. In the mid-18th century, or 1700s to clarify, the British and French empires clashed in North America in a conflict known as the French and Indian War, which was from 1754 to 1763. The war, fought over control of territory and trade routes in the Ohio River Valley, saw British forces pitted against French and Native American allies. The British ultimately emerged victorious, gaining control of French territories and Native American territories in North America. However, the war left Britain deeply in debt and prompted the British government to impose new taxes and policies on the American colonies to help pay for the cost of the war. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which imposed a direct tax on various paper goods in the colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, and playing cards. The Stamp Act was met with widespread outrage and protest in the colonies, as colonists viewed it as a violation of their rights as British subjects. Colonial leaders organized boycotts, demonstrations, and petitions against the Stamp Act, arguing that only their own elected representatives could levy taxes on them. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry for colonial resistance to British rule. Tensions between British troops and colonial civilians came to a head on March 5, 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists in Boston, killing 5 people in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The incident further inflamed anti-British sentiment in the colonies and fueled calls for independence. In 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped chests of tea into the water to protest the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea imports to the colonies. The event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a defiant act of resistance against British authority. In response to British actions and growing tensions, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia in September of 1774 for the First Continental Congress. The Congress issued a series of resolutions condemning British policies and called for a boycott of British goods until their grievances were addressed. The Congress also established the Continental Association to coordinate colonial resistance efforts and to prepare for potential military action against the British. Despite efforts to reconcile with Britain, the Continental Congress laid the groundwork for the revolutionary struggle ahead. Tensions between British troops and colonial militias reached a breaking point in April of 1775 when British soldiers marched to the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. The confrontations that ensued, known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord, marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, which was eventually won in 1783. The shot heard around the world ignited a conflict that would last for 8 years and ultimately result in the independence of the American colonies from British rule. Colonial militias known as Minutemen mobilized to defend their rights and liberties against British oppression. As the Revolutionary War raged on, the idea of independence gained momentum among colonial leaders. In June 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin to draft a formal declaration of independence from Britain. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the 13 colonies to be free and independent states, no longer subject to British rule. The Declaration asserted the fundamental principles of liberty, equality, and self-government that would shape the new American nation. The Revolutionary War was fought on multiple fronts, from the fields of New England to the shores of the southern colonies. The Continental Army, under the command of General George Washington, faced off against the powerful British military, aided by French and Spanish allies. The war was marked by decisive battles such as Saratoga, where American forces achieved a crucial victory, and Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis surrendered to American and French forces in 1781, effectively ending the war. And on the topic of France helping the United States, France also was negatively affected by helping America in the war, because that was partially what contributed to the conflict and wars going on in France in the late 1780s and early 1790s. But to be more on topic, the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized American independence and established the boundaries of the new nation. With independence secured, the newly formed United States faced the challenge of creating a government that would unite the 13 states and safeguard the principles of liberty and democracy. In 1787, delegates from the states convened in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The resulting document, the United States Constitution, established a federal system of government with a separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It also included a Bill of Rights guaranteeing fundamental liberties to citizens. The American Revolution had a profound impact not only in the United States, but also on the course of world history, like in France, which I mentioned earlier. It inspired similar movements for independence and democracy around the globe, and established the United States as a beacon for liberty and democracy. The principles of the American Revolution, including the rights of individuals, the rule of law, and representative government, continue to shape American society and influence political movements worldwide. The legacy of the Revolution lives on in the institutions, values, and ideals of the United States of America. Now moving on to the history of another one of the largest empires, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, more commonly referred to as the Soviet Union or the USSR. the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Russia was an autocratic empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty. The Russian Empire was characterized by vast social and economic inequality, widespread poverty, and political repression. The majority of the population were peasants living in rural areas, while a small elite of nobles and aristocrats held power and wealth. Industrialization had begun to transform Russia's economy, but it also brought harsh working conditions and exploitation for the growing urban working class. In February of 1917, towards the end of the First World War, which was a big deal at the time because there had never been a world war before, popular discontent with the Tsarist regime reached a boiling point, leading to a series of strikes, demonstrations, and mutinies in the capital city of Petrograd, which previous to that was called St. Petersburg, and it was renamed that in modern times. The protests were fueled by food shortages, military defeats in the First World War, and grievances against the autocratic rule of the Tsar. Facing mounting pressure, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 15, 1917, bringing an end to the centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government composed of moderate liberals and socialists was established to govern Russia in the wake of the revolution. While the February Revolution had toppled the Tsarist regime, it failed to address the deep-seated social and economic problems facing Russia. The provisional government struggled to maintain control as radical socialist factions, particularly the Bolsheviks that were led by Vladimir Lenin, gained support among workers, soldiers, and peasants, and serfs. In October of 1917, the Bolsheviks staged a coup d'etat, seizing key government buildings and declaring the overthrow of the provisional government. Lenin proclaimed the establishment of a socialist state, marking the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, also known as the October Revolution. The seizure of power by the Bolsheviks plunged Russia into a bloody civil war that lasted from 1917 to 1922. The Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, faced off against a disparate coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, known as the Whites, who were supported by various foreign powers, including Britain, France, and the United States. The Civil War was fought across Russia and involved brutal tactics, including mass executions, forced conscription, and famine as a weapon of war. The Bolsheviks ultimately emerged victorious, consolidating their control over Russia and establishing the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, also known as the RSFSR, which is an abbreviation, as the core or foundation of the new Soviet Union. In December of 1922, the RSFSR, along with several other Soviet republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, joined together to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union was the world's first socialist state, based on the principles of Marxism and Leninism, governed by the Communist Party and Socialist Party of the Soviet Union. Under the leadership of Lenin and later Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union embarked on a program of radical social and economic transformation known as socialism in one country. This included nationalizing industry, collectivizing agriculture, and implementing centralized planning to modernize the economy and build socialism and communism. Stalin emerged as the leader of the Soviet Union following Lenin's death in 1924 and embarked on a brutal campaign to consolidate power and eliminate political rivals. The period of Stalin's rule, known as Stalinism, was characterized by authoritarianism, repression, and mass terror. Although maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration, as the country had much more freedom, and the people had much more freedom than they had during the reign of the Romanovs in the Russian Empire, um, specifically the serfs and peasants. Stalin's policies, including the forced collectivization of agriculture, the Great Purge of the late 1930s, and the Gulag system of labor camps, resulted in millions of deaths and widespread suffering. Despite these atrocities, um, Stalin achieved significant industrialization and modernization, transforming the Soviet Union into a global superpower, which was also when the United States was emerging as a global superpower. During World War II, the Soviet Union played a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, which was the official name for the Nazis was the Third Reich. But it was governed by the Nazis, so that's why we call it that. Suffering immense losses, but ultimately emerging victorious. The war transformed the Soviet Union into one of the world's two superpowers alongside the United States and shaped the course of the 20th century. The post-war period saw the emergence of the Cold War, a geopolitical rivalry between the Soviet Union and the Western powers led by the United States. The Cold War was characterized by ideological competition, military buildup, and proxy conflicts around the world, as well as the threat of nuclear annihilation. Following Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union experienced a period of relative liberalization under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev denounced Stalin's cult of personality and implemented reforms aimed at reducing repression and improving living standards. However, Khrushchev's reforms were met with resistance from conservative elements within the party, leading to his ouster in 1964. Successors, including Leonid Brezhnev and Mikhail Gorbachev, presided over a period of stagnation and decline as the Soviet economy struggled to keep pace with the West, specifically the United States, which was leading the West. In the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms known as Perestroika and Glasnost, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet economy and liberalizing Soviet society. Gorbachev's reforms led to greater political freedoms, economic decentralization, and increased openness to the outside world. However, the reforms also unleashed forces to change that ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Economic stagnation, ethnic tensions, and nationalist movements in the Soviet republics undermined the cohesion of the Union, leading to its dissolution in 1991. Although the dissolution was mainly due to powerful leaders of different republics wanting independence, and an unknown, perhaps interesting fact is that with the exception of the Baltic states, which had been annexed in World War II, all of the other Soviet republics had voted to stay in the Union and keep it alive, and then just a few years later, the Union collapsed against their will. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of an era and had far-reaching consequences for Russia and the world. The Soviet Union's demise led to the emergence of new independent states in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as well as the end of the Cold War and the bipolar world order. In Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union brought about a period of political and economic upheaval known as the wild 1990s, characterized by rapid privatization, economic crisis, and social dislocation. The legacy of the Soviet Union continues to reshape Russian politics, society, and identity to this day as Russia grapples with its Soviet past while seeking to define its future in a rapidly changing world. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were formed out of civil wars and revolutions, and they both eventually emerged as global superpowers. So the United States did end up sort of winning the war, I guess you could say, in the end. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel to see more videos